I'm Conrad Hughes, and I'm very happy to be engaging with you on this topic of education and elitism. Since the agricultural revolutions that swept through humanity thousands of years ago, human beings have organized themselves in selective structures in order to achieve a formal education. Now, informal education, household education, the transmission of cultural knowledge is not what we're talking about here. I'm talking about reading, writing, mathematics, and later what would become the sciences and studies of the world. This type of education has always been in the hands of priests, initiates, gurus, and selected members of the population. For the Egyptians, it was only the high priests who could understand hieratic script hieroglyphs. If you look at ancient Greece, the followers of Plato in his Academy or Aristotle in his Lyceum were few. They were men. They were Athenians. If you look at the ancient Gurukulas in India, you find that a small group of initiates would gather around the guru to listen to the words of wisdom that that person would impart. Education was developed for small numbers. And what this meant was that interactions were rich, thinking was deep. Some of the first modern educational institutions, like madrasas, or the world's first universities in Morocco, in India, and later in Europe, in Bologna, Oxford, Paris. Even here, these institutions were not for the many, they were for the few, selective institutions. And it wasn't until really the middle of the 1800s that we started to see the idea of an education for all being implemented, with the famous Elementary Education Act of 1870, for example, in the United Kingdom, and some of the initiatives by visionaries such as Horace Mann in the United States. The modern understanding of an education is a 19th century model, where every child goes to school and education is for everybody and not just for some people. This tendency was accelerated and augmented with successive initiatives that happened throughout different societies. For example, the GI Bill in the 1940s in the United States made university more accessible to larger members of US society. Now, what's interesting is that this steady increase in exposure and access to education is mirrored by political and economic developments. After World War II, the American middle class became wealthier than ever before, and you had a huge surge in growth. And alongside this and with it, access to education. If we go back to the mid-1800s and the late 1800s, of course, we're looking at the Industrial Revolution, a huge augmentation of capital, of resources, of information, and therefore education is widened. Now, if we're to fast forward to today, we're looking at this wonderful goal of the United Nations, which is quality education for all. UNESCO's Incheon Declaration, which set 2030 as an objective for education for all, has now been superseded somewhat by Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is a quality education for all. And indeed, initiatives have shown that education is becoming more and more accessible. Now, there's a new wave of information that has, of course, superseded all of these political initiatives, which is technology. the fact that we can access knowledge through our phones, that with a broadband connection you can find out just about anything, anywhere, at any time, has changed the relationship that we have with knowledge and has implications for education that are huge. And we're still trying to figure out exactly how we can navigate this. What we do know is that literacy rates have gone up and illiteracy levels have gone down. However, we also know that there are hundreds of millions of children who still aren't in school, and this dream, this universal dream of an education for all, and even better, a high-quality education for all, is still not attained. Now, what all of this shows us is a pathway, historically, from elitism to egalitarianism. Elitism would be the model of Plato. Plato believed in the philosopher king. He said no one ignorant of geometry should enter his academy. He believed that education was for the few. He thought that democracy, just like Socrates and Aristotle, was a terrible idea. How can the demos be educated to take wise decisions? You need a monarchical, aristocratic approach. That is pure elitism. And it stays with us to this day in the form of political ideologies, such as those that were promulgated in the 1920s by the Italian elitist school, people like Mosca and Pareto. You have cultural elitism, which is a strong force to this day, the belief that there's high culture, that there is a certain refinement in aspects of knowledge and culture that are not for the many but for the few, and that there is popular culture which is of a lower level. Needless to say, we're very much in an environment in the 21st century of plutocratic elitism, meaning that a very small group of people are incredibly wealthy and a very large segment of the population is pauperized, is poor. Now, the very poorest have become slightly richer statistically en masse in the last decades, but the gap between very rich and very poor has been widened. Thomas Piketty's brilliant book, Capital in the 21st Century, shows us that disparity between access to income and inherited wealth, capital, is greater than it's ever been. So we do live in an era of economic elitism, in that there are incredibly rich people. The 8 richest men in the world, for example, own as much money as half of the world's poorest. And this is quite a divided society that we're looking at. Plato, elitism, cultural elitism, plutocratic elitism, political elitism. And of course there's this idea of meritocracy, which is that you have to earn your place. Schools should be selective. Universities should be hard to get into. You need to be at the top of the class to go far. You need to be in the top quartile of a distribution curve. Otherwise, we don't get quality. If you want a good doctor or a good surgeon to work on you, you want that person to have come out with a strong educational background and to have somehow been better than others. There is this deeply ingrained idea of elitism in much of what many of us want in a working society. And on the other hand, you have Karl Marx. He's at the other extremity. Egalitarianism, doing away with private property, making education a state-run affair, deprivatization of just about everything. The idea that much of the social hierarchy that we take for granted is in fact a bourgeois construct that's been invented to keep a small group in power. Marx's dream was of a classless society, a society where you would not have pockets of elitism. And this belief, of course, has influenced a whole group of philosophers and educators. People like Paulo Freire, the Brazilian, who talked about the pedagogy of the oppressed and thought that the teacher should be a facilitator and not a kind of strong imperialistic leader. Thinkers such as the famous Soviet educational theorist Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky's idea of social constructivism is that learning happens in a healthy environment where people are working together, not in a hierarchical structure. From Plato to Marx, elitism, cultural elitism, plutocratic elitism, meritocracy, to egalitarianism. Other Marxist principles that influence the way we look at education is the idea that you shouldn't have highly hierarchical educational systems that are extremely selective. Schools should be comprehensive. We should get rid of selective schools altogether. Schools should allow entry for everybody. Now, where does this lead us? Well, in the 21st century, we're in this very paradoxical age where we're more egalitarian than we've ever been, and at the same time, we're more elitist than we've ever been. How is this possible? Well, whilst on the one hand, there's greater literacy, there is more schooling than there's ever been in history, more women, more minority groups are able to access education than ever before. Whilst we have a number of state systems that are offering a higher quality of school and university education to young people than they have ever before, we have at the very same time, in other countries, in other parts of the world, and sometimes in the same countries, private institutions, extremely expensive institutions, highly selective institutions. One of the things that we've seen, if you look at the research, is that grammar schools, so grammar schools in England are meant to be schools that give access to children who aren't necessarily wealthy, but are very bright, and to give them a push, an accelerated education that will be challenging. We've seen that, in fact, grammar schools don't change the socio-economic demographics of the status quo that much. Most of the children who get into grammar schools are actually from middle-class backgrounds. We've also seen that wealthier children are more likely to wind up in top-tier schools, in Oxbridge, in Ivy League. There's what we call the gilded path, wealth begetting wealth. If you come from a middle-class or an upper-class background, you're exposed to elaborate code, dinner time conversation is sophisticated, there are books around you, and things like entrance exams and all sorts of supposedly need-blind protocols favor you. Whereas if you've come from an environment of illiteracy, where there's no reading material at home, where dinner conversation is not about politics or about the economy, it's that much more difficult to get in. So we're not actually managing to change these inequalities all that much. Even with scholarships. Scholarships are still not really changing the socioeconomics and the demographics of socioeconomics in a number of countries. And there's a lot of research on that. This whole situation is, from the point of view of anti-elitists, unsatisfactory. Because what we've got is a system that's favoring the privileged. Take legacy students. We know that legacy students, meaning students whose parents have studied at an Ivy League college, they're more likely to get into an Ivy League college than non-legacy students. We've also seen recently the so-called varsity blues scandal in the United States, where parents were buying places from corrupt admissions deans. They were lying about their students' profile and basically buying their way into what was meant to be a meritocratic system. It actually looks like a plutocratic system. We know that top jobs still go to students who've been to top universities. Universities are ranked. So it's a very hierarchical, very elitist system that we're still living in. And anti-elitists feel that it's wrong because too many children who come from impoverished backgrounds aren't able to climb that ladder, and the wealthy have got a kickstart, they've got a head start, they're part of a club, and so it just exacerbates inequalities. But you've got the other side of the story. Okay, you've got Plato criticizing, if you like, Marx, the pro-elitists, and they have a few things to say. They say that there are now too many graduate holders. Since universities have become massified, there are too many masters and PhDs. 2/3 of graduate degree holders have regrets because they spend a lot of money going into university, and yet they come out with degrees that might not earn them jobs. We also know that in the UK, first-class degrees are soaring. In other words, more and more university students are graduating with first-class passes. What does that mean? Well, if the market's saturated with double MA students, graduates, with PhDs, with first-class passes, then who's going to get selected? How does it work? There's a feeling that standards are dropping as well. Standards are dropping, grades are being inflated. It's too easy in many schools. There's a feeling that being able to access university in some countries, some educational systems, just because you've passed high school, it's not fair. And it's creating a cynical system where undergraduate studies are too full, and therefore they are made extremely difficult, and there's huge attrition. There's another problem. It's student debt. Student debt in the United States is a massive problem. It's trillions of dollars. And what we're seeing is that students are wondering now if they should actually go to university. Is it worth it? Google, Apple, and at least 12 other big companies are saying that they'll take students who haven't been to university. They don't actually need a college degree anymore. So what's the point? What's the point of spending all that money? And we're talking to about $70,000 US, everything included, if you really want a sort of top-tier experience. What's the point of spending all that money, of going into debt, if so many people out there have top degrees, if the market's become saturated, and there are firms that are employing students who haven't even been to university? So let's just recap this. It's Plato versus Marx. Plato says universities should be elitist, schools should be selective, you have to have hierarchy because this creates quality. The Marxists, if you like, will say we're in an unfair system, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and it's incredibly difficult to access education and wealth. Now the big question is, the question that cuts through all of this, it's a simple question. It's, what is the purpose of an education? What is the purpose? And that's where we need to go back to this old principle of the skole, the Greek word which means a place of leisure, a place where you can think, a place where you become a rich individual, a place where you build a community of learners, a place where you're interested in knowledge for the sake of knowledge, a place where you become a better human being and a better scholar. Now, there are systems that achieve this. For example, Switzerland. Switzerland is a very, very rigorous, free state system. And it has some of the best universities in the world that are basically for free. They cost very little. You take EPFL or ETHZ, they're in the top 20, and yet they're free. And any student who passes the maturité examination can get in. Now, it's true that there is some selection earlier on, but if you can't get into the maturité course, you go into a professional stream, which is very popular in Switzerland. It's not looked down on as a second-class education. It yields incredible employment. The Swiss model is a very interesting model. But what is Switzerland? It's a country with direct democracy. It's a country with an incredibly robust tax system. It's a wealthy country. Economics and education go hand in hand. And this is the challenge for so many societies. How do we create an environment where you have quality and you have access? Now, 2020 is breaking point. Black Lives Matter movement, shouting out about racial elitism throughout educational institutions, lack of access. You've got anti-globalization movements which are becoming more and more virulent because people are finding that they're pauperized in an unfair system that is governed by unbridled neoliberal forces. Coronavirus is widening the gap between haves and have-nots. It's widening the digital divide. It's widening the gap between students who are able to access the curriculum and those who struggle to access the curriculum. We're heading into a very difficult place. And we've got to come together and design educational systems that allow quality and access, and stop this fighting between Plato and Marx. Stop this polarized environment that's either for or against elitism, and look for something that allows for equality and quality. We owe that to the planet. We owe it to our children. And if you read my book that's coming out in March on education and elitism, you'll be able to find out more.